This is a story about power, immunity, and a single gunshot that's tearing a nation apart. A former president is demanding absolute protection for a federal agent who killed a woman. And that demand is forcing a brutal question into the spotlight: who is above the law? We are talking about a case that goes to the very heart of American justice, immigration enforcement, and political power. This is not just a legal debate. It is a battle for accountability happening right now. Stay with us. To understand why this story is explosive, you need the full picture. Let's rewind. The central figure is Renee Good. In 2017, Renee was a 31-year-old woman living in Tucson, Arizona. By all accounts, she was a beloved sister and aunt. Her family described her as kind-hearted. On the morning of June 16, 2017, Renee was a passenger in a car. That car was pulled over by U.S. Border Patrol agents. The driver was suspected of smuggling undocumented immigrants. During the stop, according to official accounts, the vehicle began to move. Agent Lonnie Swartz, positioned on the Mexican side of the border fence, fired his weapon. 16 times, through the border fence. Bullets pierced the car's door and body. Renee Good was struck multiple times and died. Agent Swartz claimed he was in fear for his life, believing the car was going to ram other agents. But prosecutors argued the car was moving away, not toward anyone. This set the stage for a monumental legal fight. Agent Swartz was charged with second-degree murder, a rare instance of a federal officer facing such a charge for an on-duty shooting. His first trial in 2018 ended in a mistrial. A second trial in 2019 found him not guilty of second-degree murder, but the jury deadlocked on voluntary and involuntary manslaughter charges. Federal prosecutors eventually dropped the remaining charges. Swartz was never convicted, but the case never went away. It became a symbol. For immigration advocates, it symbolized the deadly, unchecked power of border enforcement. For some law enforcement supporters, it symbolized the unfair prosecution of an officer making a split-second decision. Now, enter Donald Trump. The former president, while in office, had publicly defended Agent Swartz. He called the prosecution a disgrace. And now, in the context of his own legal battles over presidential immunity, Trump has forcefully reinserted himself into this painful story, demanding what he calls absolute immunity for the agent. This brings us to today's deep dive. So what exactly is happening now? Based on our sources, here are the core facts. Donald Trump, in a recent speech and in social media posts, has explicitly called for absolute immunity for former Border Patrol agent Lonnie Swartz. He framed this not just as support for one man, but as a necessary principle for all law enforcement. Trump stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, that we must respect our law enforcement and that agents must be free to do their jobs without the threat of prosecution. This is a direct intervention into a closed criminal case. It's a powerful political statement with immediate legal reverberations. Let's look at the numbers because they tell a stark story. According to a 2020 report by the nonprofit group Human Rights Watch, U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers and Border Patrol agents have killed at least 98 people since 2010. In that same time frame, only 3 agents have ever been charged with a crime related to an on-duty shooting. Only one, Agent Swartz, was charged with murder. 0 have been convicted. This is the statistical reality that forms the backdrop of Trump's demand. Official responses have been swift and divided. The National Border Patrol Council, the agents' union, praised Trump's stance. They argue agents face impossible, dangerous situations and need legal protection to act decisively. Conversely, the Good Family's attorney and numerous civil rights organizations have condemned the statement as dangerous and inflammatory. They argue it sends a message that border agents operate in a legal vacuum, a constitution-free zone, where the use of deadly force faces no meaningful oversight. Legal experts we consulted note the timing is highly significant. Trump is currently arguing before the U.S. Supreme Court that he, as a former president, should enjoy absolute immunity from prosecution for official acts during his presidency. By demanding the same for a federal agent, he is weaving a broader narrative that expansive immunity is necessary for those in positions of authority to govern and enforce effectively. It links his personal legal fate to that of law enforcement officers nationwide, a potent political fusion. This is not just about one shooting from 2017. It is about establishing a precedent for the future of accountability. Now, let's examine the different perspectives. The opposition viewpoint is rooted in constitutional law and human rights. Advocacy groups point to the Fourth Amendment, which protects citizens from unreasonable seizures, which includes deadly force. They argue that the doctrine of qualified immunity, which already shields government officials from lawsuits unless they violate clearly established rights, is already a significant barrier to justice. Trump's call for absolute immunity, would remove that barrier entirely. They ask if an agent faces no legal consequence for firing 16 rounds through a fence into a car, what check remains on their power? The counter-argument from the law enforcement perspective hinges on the nature of the job. The US-Mexico border is portrayed as a uniquely perilous environment. Agents confront armed cartels, human traffickers, and potentially violent individuals daily. They argue that the threat of prosecution paralyses officers, causing fatal hesitation. They say the Swartz case is a perfect example of an agent making a reasonable, if tragic, decision under extreme duress, only to be hounded for years by politically motivated prosecutors. There is an international dimension here as well. Human rights bodies like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have repeatedly criticized the United States for a lack of transparency and accountability in border killings. The Renee Good case is often cited internationally as evidence of a systemic problem. When a leading presidential candidate calls for absolute immunity, it sends a signal to the world about American priorities, potentially damaging diplomatic relations on human rights issues. The deeper analysis reveals this is a clash of two fundamental American values: security and liberty. The absolute immunity argument prioritizes security and operational efficiency above all else. It views the border as a war zone requiring wartime rules of engagement. The opposing view prioritizes liberty, due process, and the principle that no one, not even a government agent, is above the law. It views the border not as a war zone, but as American soil where the Constitution must fully apply. This debate is also deeply personal. For the Good family, it reopens a wound. They have lived for 7 years with what they see as a denial of justice. Trump's statements pour salt on that wound, telling them their sister's life is worth less than an unaccountable principle. For Agent Swartz and his supporters, it is a long-awaited vindication, a statement that his service and the impossible choices he faced are finally understood at the highest level. How does this affect ordinary people? Let's break it down. First, for communities living along the border. Imagine living in a region where the federal agents tasked with policing have been told, by a potential future president, that they should operate with absolute immunity. The psychological impact is profound. It creates a power dynamic where residents, especially those of color or mixed immigration status families, may feel they cannot question authority or report abuses for fear of reprisal with no recourse. Trust between community and law enforcement, already fragile, evaporates. Second, for ordinary law enforcement officers across America. While Trump's comments are about border agents, the principle, if adopted, could expand. Police unions might demand similar protections, arguing their jobs are also dangerous. This could fundamentally alter policing in your town or city, making it harder to hold officers accountable for misconduct. The economic implications are also real. Lawsuits against police and federal agencies cost taxpayers millions every year. Immunity could reduce those payouts, but at the cost of removing a key financial incentive for departments to reform training and practices. The social and political ramifications are the most explosive. This issue is a lightning rod in the culture wars. It solidifies the dividing line between two Americas, one that sees strong, unfettered enforcement as the path to safety, and one that sees it as the path to authoritarianism. It mobilizes voters on both sides. It influences how millions of people view the legitimacy of their own government. So what happens next? The immediate next step is political. Trump's framing will become a staple of his campaign rallies. It will be debated in Congress. Legislation could even be drafted to expand legal protections for federal agents, though it would face fierce opposition in the Senate. In the longer term, the ultimate consequence will be decided by the Supreme Court. Their ruling on Trump's presidential immunity case will indirectly shape this broader debate. If they grant presidents broad immunity, the argument for extending similar protections to the executive branch's enforcement arms becomes legally and politically stronger. This story is a pebble thrown into a pond, and the ripples are just beginning to reach the shore. What are the experts saying? We spoke to several legal analysts. Professor Laura Gomez, a constitutional law scholar, told us, the leap from qualified to absolute immunity is a chasm, not a step. Qualified immunity is controversial, but it at least pays lip service to constitutional limits. Absolute immunity says there are no limits. It would be a radical restructuring of the relationship between the state and the citizen. A former federal prosecutor, who asked not to be named, offered a different take. The Swartz prosecution was always a long shot. Juries are extremely reluctant to second-guess officers in violent, fluid situations. The call for immunity is more about politics than law, It's about changing the public perception and narrative around these cases, making prosecution unthinkable rather than just unlikely. Comparisons are being drawn to other moments in history. Some analysts see echoes of the law and order rhetoric of the 1960s and 70s, which prioritized police power during social unrest. Others draw a more disturbing parallel to countries where security forces operate with impunity, noting that the hallmark of a democratic society is that its enforcers are subject to the law. Predictions are divided. Some forecast that this rhetoric will lead to more aggressive border tactics in the short term, as agents feel politically backed. Others predict a backlash, galvanizing civil rights litigation and protest even without successful prosecutions. The consensus forecast is that this issue will not go away. Whether through the Supreme Court, a future administration's policies, or continued grassroots activism, the question of how much immunity a government agent deserves will define American justice for years to come. The key takeaway is this: a 7-year-old border shooting has become the frontline in a new American war over immunity. It's a war about who gets protected and who gets forgotten. Watch for the Supreme Court's decision on presidential immunity. It will directly influence this debate. Watch for how this rhetoric influences the attitudes and actions of border agents in the coming months. And watch for the political firestorm that is guaranteed to follow. This story is about more than one agent or one president. It is about the soul of American law. Subscribe to Kenya News Update today for more breaking news and deep dive analysis from around the world.